Hi everyone. Welcome to our last Vision Australia check-in and chat webinar today on Thursday, the 2nd of July. Today's topic is finding the funny side of life. I'm Dan Casey and I'll be your host for today's webinar. And really looking forward to today's topic. And we have Tom Skelton as our expert guest. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we're all meeting today, and I'd just like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Also remember that a recording of today's webinar can be accessed via our webpage at www.visionaustralia.org/check-in and chat. Now, during the webinar, you can submit your questions via the chat functionality, and people who are using screen readers, you can access the chat function through Alt-H. We will do our best to answer the questions as we go and as time permits. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Tom Skelton to our webinar today. Hi, Tom. How are you going?
Not too bad. Hello, Dan. I am, I've only just woken up, so I am a little bit groggy, but otherwise ready to go.
Okay, so Tom's just woken up. Why have you just woken up, Tom? It's because you're a late sleeper? No.
No, I am actually in the UK, so I am. I think it's 5 p.m. in the eastern states at the moment, is it?
Correct.
But it's 8 a.m. here in the UK, so
Okay.
I am. Yeah, possibly I should have woken up, a bit earlier, but I'm here.
Excellent. And whereabouts in the UK are you, Tom? Just out of interest.
I am currently in the fine city of Milton Keynes, about halfway between Birmingham and London.
Fantastic.
If anyone knows it.
Fantastic. All right. So Tom, today we're talking about the funny side of life. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became a comedian.
Yes, so I've always wanted, I've always enjoyed humour and hearing jokes and trying to be funny myself. And I suppose I always remember, like, especially my grandpa telling jokes and telling funny stories around the dinner table. And then at school, I think there was like a sense in which you had to be either really tough or at football or funny to sort of survive the playground in a way. And I definitely wasn't the first one. I was okay at the second one. This was before I lost my sight. And then at the third one, I had to sort of thrive. So I've always sort of had it as an instinct. And then when I was at university, there was an opportunity to audition for an improvised comedy group. And I just thought I might as well have a go, see if I can do it formally as well as informally. And I was lucky enough to get in, and then it sort of went from there.
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple of really interesting things there. You know, that instinct for comedy and also that doing it informally versus formally. So I guess I'm just interested in that instinct. How would you describe that instinct? How does that play out for you?
Yeah, so I suppose that it's very much like when you're in a family or friend situation, telling a joke or telling a funny story and getting that laughter, that reaction from people is just something it's something I always found very invigorating and something I could always bounce off and made me feel energized and excited. And so
it's reinforcing. Sorry, it's reinforcing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think once that feeling is sort of addictive and exciting, then yeah, as you say, it reinforces yourself and you want to try and get it again and again. And I remember, probably witnessing other people laughs, or I remember, as a very small little boy, that sort of feeling of, being entertaining, being being funny and making people happy by making them laugh.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned there also about losing vision. So does having a impairment actually influence your comedy? And if so, how? Talk to us a bit about that.
Definitely influences it. Yes. I I sort of initially, when I lost my most of my sight, I didn't want it to be a sort of central defining part of my comedy. Um, in the improv groups, it was not a central part of it or a central theme. It was we were playing, various different roles and scenarios, and I wanted to be judged on the quality of my comedy rather than have the disability be a central thing for people watching. And in my solo stuff as well, I I suppose initially I didn't want to be defined as a as a blind comedian. When it's something that's so like central to your identity and also such a different part of your identity to most people's experience, I think it's that it's something people will find fascinating, and also by not having written about it and done comedy about it before, in the end I felt like it was something, it was the elephant in the room for
Yeah.
my. So the last few years I've started to do shows and comedy about my sight loss and my experiences as a VIP.
Yeah, VIP. Um, and what's been the audience's reaction to that stuff? Do you think have they enjoyed it? Do they find it confronting or?
I think there's elements in which they do find confronting, and I'm aware of that. And so before nearly all of my shows, I tell them, um, you know, I am genuinely, visually impaired, genuinely blind, but it's absolutely fine to laugh. I want you to laugh. I need you to laugh.
I need you, yeah.
And there's because I think people who are sighted, often their instinctive reaction is, oh, I shouldn't be laughing at this. Once you've given them that permission, and also the very practical reason, I can't sort of psychologically afford to have as many smilers or gentle chucklers. I need to have a bit more of a belly laugh in my audience so that I know I'm doing well or not.
Yeah.
And I think it's also made me more comfortable, because previous shows, especially as a solo performer, there might be moments where I've got little props or costumes. If I drop them on the stage, and remember one particular time where I dropped a little bit of costume and I just couldn't find it again. And I hadn't mentioned why. So the audience was thinking that this moment where I was just not seeing or not finding this thing that was to them right in front of me, and they thought it was part of the act, but I didn't really mention it, and I probably got a little bit flustered. So later on, any sort of idiosyncratic movement I make, or knocking something over on the stage, or they know why that is, so it probably makes me more comfortable physically on the stage, and just in doing the show.
And humor and comedy has that incredible ability, doesn't it, to kind of flatten a lot of
Mm,
uncomfortableness or awkwardness, and I know in our workplace, humor is used a lot to sort of ease tension or to give people that sort of break. So I would imagine it can be quite powerful in terms of messages around people who might be blind or have low vision, in terms of it. Yeah. Funny stuff still happens. Yeah.
yeah, I think so. And I think when people, I think it's that mixture of people finding out the about experiences of living with visual impairment. They also realize that their perception might not be correct, like their assumption. Also that I try to stress that this is just my individual experience, and it's not a
Universal.
uniform,
Yeah.
yeah, for people. But I think that's right. That when it's entertaining, hopefully entertaining, people maybe are more open to taking the message in, and when it's not like a sort of a precious lecturing sort of
Lecture. Yeah.
message, even though there's obviously important times for that as well. Sometimes people are just more open to something that's entertaining them at the same time as
Well,
informing them about someone's experience.
and the entertaining stuff, in my experience, is also you've got people engaged and you've got their attention.
Mm, yeah, I think that's right. You can sort of almost, if my secret mission is to, make sure that people understand more about visual impairment, if that is, and it is, part of my uh, desire to do. If that was my ultimate one, then I can lull them into this false sense of security, and then sucker punch them with this message
Yeah,
once they're rolling in the aisles. I'm
that's
setting up
right.
a very sort of
That's right.
idealized version.
Here comes the pratfall. Bang. Um,
Exactly,
so,
exactly.
so talking about that, one of the things I'm interested in, what are some of the themes in your comedy? I mean, obviously you've touched a little bit on the vision impairment and things, but I mean, obviously your repertoire or genre is much wider than that. So, what are some of the themes in your shows or your comedy?
Yeah, well, I of my solo shows, I'll go through them laboriously one by one for so I'm sure that'll be fascinating for you. But my first one was Fool Ball, which was the history of the greatest football or soccer club that never existed, and I think that was basically a sort of character comedy, ostensibly about a football club, but was a sort of look back at British history and politics through the previous 150 years through the lens of this strange football club who had basically with a sort of originally a communist football club founded by Karl Marx when he was living in London. And the problem was they always played for a draw because that was the
Sure.
most
Yeah.
egalitarian result.
And didn't have a captain. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Then later had a manager who was very authoritarian and so it was a life lesson. And then in 2016 I did a show called 2061, which was a sort of Orwellian take on the world and political situation at that point. So like Orwell wrote 1984 in 1948,
48. Yeah.
I cleverly wrote 2061 in 2016, and it was a sort of look ahead to this world, like a post-Brexit, post-Trump. Although Trump hadn't won at that point, so that did seem like a weird joke that he might win, and all the consequences that would flow, and references to 1984. And then, so that's the sort of pre me
Yeah.
doing stuff about blindness, and then since then I've done Blind Man's Bluff was the first show I did about blindness, and that was about my diagnosis and sight loss, and then also the history of the greatest blind people, in who've ever lived, basically. So it was this ophthalmologist trying to reassure me about losing my sight and giving all these amazing examples of blind people, but some of them create the comedy, some of them weren't the best examples in there. And then since that one, I've also done Blind I Spy, which was about my adventures as a blind spy in post-Brexit Berlin. And then this year, I did 2020 Visions, What If I Hadn't Gone Blind, which looks back on a decade since losing my sight, what that decade's been like, and also wondering what might have been if I hadn't lost my sight. Yeah. And I did throw in a one-man Macbeth somewhere along the way as
Gotta
well,
love it.
which was
Yeah.
which I'll have to bring back one day if I do make it back to Edinburgh, if we ever get beyond lockdown.
I like the
So that's
idea.
yeah.
I like the idea of the one, the one man Macbeth. Might
That
tell.
one was, it involved a lot of witches
Yeah,
wigs.
yeah, got a few costume changes and Burnham Wood moving and things. But it certainly sounds like when I listen to you talk about that, there's a really strong commentary theme on our times in sort of looking back and looking forward. So that sounds great. And you were booked, weren't you, to come to the Melbourne Comedy Festival? Am I right?
Yeah, I was, and it was yeah. So I was just finishing off Adelaide Fringe, having done
Mm.
Perth and New Zealand Fringe, and obviously, as we all know, things changed very very quickly in March, and then Melbourne announced it on Friday the 13th that it wasn't going ahead. So yeah, there was a strange, like as you say, like looking back and looking ahead and thinking about counterfactual realities. There's obviously been there's a period in March and April where I was thinking, I could be doing my seventh show or something in Melbourne
Yeah,
right now if
if
the world
only.
had. Yeah.
So thinking about comedy, what makes you laugh? What stuff do you find funny or find yourself laughing at?
I think I really like some of the like British sitcoms, um, like The Thick of It, Peep Show, Faulty Towers. Uh, I do like satirical stuff like Brass Eye and The Day to Day, and then also just very. I do like sort of silliness and surrealness like Monty Python are the sort of most classic example. But
Yeah,
I like to find my friends and my girlfriend are the people who make me laugh the most. Like, and that's a sort of there's an intimacy there where they can make you laugh so easily, and I think that's sort of one of the challenges for comedians to try and build up that intimacy with an audience
yeah,
in such a short amount of time.
it's a real skill, isn't it? Because you're quite right, and my observation is, particularly British humour is built around banter, that ability.
Mm,
And banter is often built around familiarity or universal experiences. And I think of
yeah.
lots of, and I know this is kind of making huge stereotypes, but a lot of British people I've met tend to have that much more than sort of Australian people, that sort of
Mm,
banter, that chit chat. And I think the intimacy point's really interesting. So when you're performing, how do you
yeah.
go about trying to get that intimacy really quickly with an audience?
I I definitely have a moment before any show where I make it clear that I do a sort of pre-show announcement and tell them, tell them stuff like, you're allowed to laugh at the blind jokes, etc. Um, sort of, yeah, just trying to establish that informality. And I think my style is quite, there's not really a fourth wall. It's
Yeah.
very ragged and intentionally um, intentionally sort of fly by the seat of my pants. And then I think that sort of encourages. I think if an audience knows it's watching um, someone doing a show and they can get to know that person, I feel like for me that's the best way to create an intimacy with the audience because
You get that connection,
then
don't you?
exactly, and they feel like you know that's Tom doing this show who I know because of those few minutes where I've sort of spoken to them before, and it's maybe it's so it doesn't always work for some people. Some people it's better to have a more of a
Yeah.
distance between them and the audience, but I find
And do you
it's
find some, sorry,
no.
do you find
I
some shows and some audiences are better? Well, it's easier to have got that connection than other shows or audiences.
Yeah, it's interesting that night to night, an audience has its own like collective character,
Yeah.
which is very hard to put your finger on. But you'll, like, when people are coming in and I'm sort of saying hello to them and greeting them, you can tell, normally you can tell from their energy and from the sort of general vibe about them if they're going to be very like a giving and switched on, switched in audience. And then you're either proved right or wrong with the reaction to the first couple of jokes. But that's always very interesting. Like
Oh,
it's hard to put your finger on, but
it, it
it's
is. Yeah.
you can sense it very quickly. And sometimes it might just be a sense of, there's if a majority is up for it, then that'll spread, through the crowd. But if there's enough people who aren't quite into it, sort of, the peer pressure will almost spread, and people, like, an audience doesn't want to appear uncool by liking stuff that most of the audience doesn't. So there might just be, that instinctive, oh, I better not, show that I'm liking this.
It's a real nuance, isn't it? Because I know when I'm an audience member, I want to like the person, but I then don't want to be sort of the kid down the
Yeah,
front of the class. Oh yeah, this is great, but I do want the person to succeed. And I'm
yeah,
always intrigued by, my feelings of almost vicarious awkwardness when the person's dying up there, as the saying goes. So
yeah, definitely,
yeah,
definitely. And it's very interesting when sometimes you can even get, can sometimes get, if someone's like a particularly loud laugher, they can almost spread their own enthusiasm across the audience. It's quite rare, but it's
yeah.
why I think some comedians love to have certain, loud laughers in
Well,
there.
I should be on the payroll because I think the people behind the production tonight will laugh at this. And I'm a loud laugher, and I'm one of those people in the audience who is quickly just, killing myself laughing. And often it's stuff that is relatively inane as well. I don't know if it's some medical condition I've got or not, but you're right. It is really interesting how I think we're herd animals, aren't we? In a way that, if
Mm,
someone's laughing or a couple of people are laughing and you're not, you think, oh, am I missing something? You know?
yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
We've just got some interesting questions coming through,
Oh, yeah.
Tom, and one of them's about comedians. So this is from Craig. So many comedians get their inspiration from everyday life. And probably more likely visual stimulus.
Mm,
So where might you get your inspiration from then, Tom? I know you've probably touched a bit on some of that reflection, but thinking about where you might get your everyday life stuff.
yeah, I think I've in the last few years, um, especially when I've been doing shows about visual impairment, my visual impairment, whenever there has been a funny moment or an amusing moment, and they are, some of them are quite common among blind and partially sighted people, but obviously some of them are going to be unique. And I think I just try to remember, write them down, and
Yeah,
write them down with their specifics, but also with their sort of universality. And so because people who are sighted will have never thought about that before and find it fascinating, and people who are blind or have low vision nearly always have recognition in terms of exactly the same thing has happened, or something similar has happened but with a slight twist. Like the one that's always, especially when I've got like a blind or partially sighted audience, and I talk about one New Year where we've been celebrating New Year, but then we're about to go out. But I'm assuming that I've got sort of stale breath because I've had a few beers, and I'm at this person's house. I'm traveling. I've travelled sort of cheap and light, so I've only brought my toothbrush and not
yeah,
toothpaste. And I go up to their bathroom and grab their toothpaste, or so I thought. And then I always ask people, like, what do you think I actually put on my toothbrush instead of toothpaste? And it's interesting the number of different answers that I get. Like, I've had people guessing, what's that, deep heat,
Deep heat,
uh,
yeah.
deep heat cream, shampoo, all this
Yeah.
different stuff, sun cream. But for me, that time it was foundation. So yeah, I think stuff like that, everyday stuff that, either is everyday or occurs quite rarely, like that one, thank goodness, is
Yeah.
stuff I have to remember to write down, because it's actually it's interesting, in the sort of specifics and the reality of it, as much as
Yeah, and a lot of,
stuff you can make up sometimes.
but that's true, isn't it? A lot of funny stuff happens around you. I mean, I've spent my working life in organizations, and that's just a hotbed of comedic material with people not
Definitely.
trying to be funny, but it's
Yeah.
absolutely hilarious. Before we came on, we were talking about, a former colleague of mine and their obsession with their cup,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
then you feel bad because, maybe the person had some issues or whatever. But from my perspective, it's like, oh, that's just pure gold. And I guess that leads to another question, which has sort of come through again from one of our people online, around, so what's okay and what's off limits. So, thinking if you're doing humour around blindness and low vision, what's okay to joke about, what's not okay to joke about, do you think? Or is it, I mean, I don't think it's that black and white, but what's your sort of
Mm.
moral, sort of ethical compass around that humour?
Well, I think for me, in terms of material about blindness and low vision, I think anything that I feel might, that has the potential to slightly, offend or upset someone, as long as I couch it in terms of my own experience or
Okay. Yep.
something that's happened to me, I think that's fine, because it's me, describing something that's happened to me, and as long as, if I'm saying something where I am the idiot or the target of the story, and something that's really, like, sad or harrowing or difficult, but as long as it's happened to me, and as long as I then tell it sensitively,
Yeah.
then I think for me, that's really all within limits. And there might be something that has happened to me that I wouldn't say, but I suppose I want to keep both the audience feeling comfortable enough, and I think comfortable enough to laugh and comfortable enough to take things insensitively. And as long as I'm treading that path by making it very much about my own experience, if it is one of those sensitive or slightly off limits topics, then that's,
Yeah.
for me, that's fine.
And it's a little more delicate almost these days, isn't it, with the world of identity politics and what's okay and what's not okay. And again, thinking of workplaces,
Yeah.
having to be, which I think in a way is good, having to be a lot more aware that just because I find something hilarious at someone's expense doesn't mean I then need to share that with everybody. But I suppose with
Yeah.
a comedy show, I can't help but think, um, that you're going to something that's about humor, that is about having a funny reflection or observation of things. So I think there's probably, I don't know, a little bit more leeway there. But do you find yourself having to think carefully about some gags or some things that you're doing, or thinking that that's not okay?
I think it's always good to make sure you haven't just included something because you found it funny in your room sitting there one day. You have to make sure you're comfortable enough saying that in front of an audience, and yeah, what it if it does potentially have, like, connotations or repercussions, And I think also, I think I always want to make sure that I'm, punching up. If I am
Okay. Yeah.
making jokes about other other people, or jokes not about myself or my own experience, like make sure you're punching up or punching in, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah. No.
but then also, if you if it is could be like a common experience, then making sure it's done sensitively.
Yeah.
You're right that
Yeah.
there is like much more awareness of it through identity politics, and I think that has interestingly made it almost more, um, like people are expected almost to only talk about their own experience, and I think that, that in a way is a bit difficult and dangerous in a way, because it, not necessarily dangerous, but it shouldn't make people not want to reach out and try and talk about a sort of, the external world and other people and their communities. It can make people more sensitive when they do that, but shouldn't stop
Yeah.
people, trying to understand the world and community around them. It
And I
shouldn't
think,
just be about someone's narrow world.
yeah, and I think comedy's played a really important role in our world in terms of it's a really great way to gently criticize or get people to look at things that perhaps aren't great and do that in that sort of engaging, enticing, seductive, funny way that you're laughing because you know what they're pointing out is true, you know,
Yeah,
and without getting into, the psychodynamics of humor, but that's part of it, as well as some
yeah.
things just being hilariously funny as well. Um, I guess I just want to keep our conversation moving a bit, but we talked a little bit. You talked a little bit earlier about improv, so improvisation. So,
Hmm.
do you want to talk a little bit to us about what that is, so just people are clear about what improvisation is? And I've just got a couple of questions for you around that.
Yeah, so improvisation is basically, well, improvised comedy is what I do, and, um, it's a mixture of, it's basically comedy that's made up on the. I'm really, really, mucking up this explanation, aren't I? But
Well, you're
I'll start from the
improvising now,
beginning.
aren't you?
I am totally improvising terribly. So it's comedy made up on the spot, based on audience suggestions,
Okay.
and it can either have like a structure of games, so like improvised songs that rhyme, guessing games, like jokes and uh, joke competitions, and then also there's more sort of like narrative, longer form improv, and, I've done sort of, various different types. So the shorter
Yep.
game themed and the longer narrative themed.
Yep. I know here in Australia they used to do. There was a lot of theatre sports, which was a similar
Mm.
improvisation where there were structures, and then there was a whole array of improvised Hamlet and Macbeth, and yeah, that audience participation around, involvement. So, what are some of the things you've learned from doing that improvisation that can be applied to your day-to-day life?
I think the importance of listening to the person you're doing a scene with,
Mm,
and thereby the importance of listening in everyday life. So listening to someone you're having a conversation with, like a friend, um, in the workplace, making sure you've listened to someone, in a meeting. We all know that can be difficult sometimes to keep listening in a meeting. But, and also there, then you can react to what they exactly have said. And I think that's important, to base your reaction
yeah,
on, on the actual words someone has said.
I think that's a really important part because so often people plan and prepare, but things don't
Mm,
always go that way. And I think that ability to improvise, as you say, brings you to the moment where you've got to deal with
yeah.
what's happening in front of you. And I wonder also, I mean, improvisation, from my understanding from a theatre and comedy perspective, is about, what do they call it? Accepting the offer. So
Yeah.
you're actually saying, so when you say to me, hey, you know, look out for that cow behind you. I don't say, well, there's no cow behind me, and how could you see the cow anyway? You know, whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
Bad taste joke
exactly.
straight away. Good work, Dan. But you know, that whole thing of, I go, yeah, the cow behind me. And I think that's a really
Exactly.
important skill for people to have, is don't diss everything everybody says. Actually,
Yeah,
can you work with it?
yeah, definitely. And yeah, it is that you build that world together,
Yeah.
and I think that's yeah, anything and everything can be important that you um it makes what people are saying and offering to you important,
And
um
yeah.
and makes you use everything that
Oh, now we're getting deep and
um
meaningful.
that people are offering.
Yeah. And it makes life a little more about fullness and richness rather than
Yeah,
what you don't have. So rather than deficit, it's about abundance. Anyway, oh,
yeah, that's a very good way of putting it.
well,
I
so,
like that.
yeah, you can have that one. There you go. So told you you'd get something out of it. Um,
Exactly.
so I guess I've got a question for you as well, and someone's also asked a couple of questions about this sight gags. My experience of going to particularly improvisation and things, there's a lot of visual cues. There's a lot of, you know, sort of gags around sight
Yeah.
things. How have you navigated through that?
Yeah, so I suppose that I have so I suppose I have the advantage of having had sight once, which
Okay.
maybe means that I am better at sight gags, but not necessarily, because some I know that some blind people since birth are good at sight gags anyway. So I'm told, from being in from being in meetings or workshops with blind people, like the amount of sight gags done by people blind since birth. So uh, I'll come to that in a second,
Okay.
but I think that maybe I can remember what a sight gag is. So then we've got this situation which is plays totally to my advantage, that
Yeah.
I'm allowed to make a sight gag and I'm still
Okay.
being respectful of my team partner, but they're not allowed to make a sight
Yeah.
gag. So in a way, the sight gags are still open to me.
Yeah.
Then there has been quite a few situations, having said that, where the person I'm doing a scene with either doesn't know the extent of my lack of vision, or just doesn't remember or forgets. And there's been a few things where someone will make quite a subtle physical gesture,
Yeah.
and I just uh,
Pick it up.
won't notice it and will plow on regardless.
Yeah.
So I think, in a way, it forces people to. Well, I know it forces them to adapt to whatever decisions I make. Um,
Yeah.
there's also been some quite funny moments where someone will be holding something very small,
That's what I was
proffer to
thinking.
me, and I will say, you brought me, a dog, and they're holding this dog between their thumb and
Yeah.
index finger.
Yeah. Yeah. That
I
sounds.
think it's also, sorry, it's to into barrel over you,
No,
but
that's right.
it's
You're the
also
guest.
been it's been, I suppose, I've always um, taken ownership about just naming something, even if I can't see it,
Yep.
because the first time I almost noticed that I was losing some vision was actually during an improv show, and I had started to notice, like, vision loss in one eye, and I was in a scene with someone, and they did a very subtle gesture, and I was looking right at the person at what they were doing and didn't see it,
Yeah.
and I sort of missed this visual clue that sort of derailed the scene. And I think that sort of memory has stayed with me, and so I won't. If there is a sort of visual clue now, I will just define it on my own terms and let the contrast create the comedy, or just make sure that I'm the one initially defining stuff from my own perspective.
And that's a great example of including that into the structure of what you're doing, rather than it making that structure fall apart. I think that's for me, those skills of improvisation, is to be able to go, right, it's actually part of what we're doing, so we've got to roll with it. And again, I think there's really good lessons. I know this webinar is about finding the funny side or the lighter side of life. I think there's really good lessons of that to take. How does one roll with these issues? How do you incorporate it into what's actually being discussed, talked about, or done? Just on the visual stuff, there's another question on the list of questions that just talks about, what do you think of audio description and visual comedy? Now, for me, my brain goes straight to that could actually be really funny, because the audio description could be done in such a deadpan voice describing what's going on that it's actually not funny, and the fact that it's not funny is actually funny.
Yeah.
That's me. But do you think there's a role with audio description and that sort of visual stuff?
I think so, because it's. I suppose my most common experience of audio description is going to see a comedian, and they'll be mainly verbal, but they'll occasionally do something visual.
Yep.
And my most common experience is the person next to me, my friend, will whisper in my ear, and it's very interesting. And I'm sure lots of people on the webinar will have experienced this. Some friends are not so good at it. They will give either too much or too little information, so that if they might give too much information and you then miss a bit more of what the comedian is saying, or they will they'll give so quick or different information that you won't understand it regardless. But a couple of friends are just very good at very brief but
apt,
detailed enough information. And so I think there's a real use of just good, quick, functional audio description, where Definitely. It does just say he's patting his head.
Yep.
and that will
that's
mean the joke is understandable.
That's the 10th step out of it. You've got 9 out of 10 through the audit, what you've heard.
Exactly.
I've always liked the idea of, we certainly do audio description at Vision Australia for a whole range of things. I've toyed with the idea of kind of like the plot describer. So you go to a show and it's a complex plot. You can have someone sitting next to you going, okay, so the guy's just come on. He's the uncle who previously was married to the blah, blah, blah. Just to sort of help those like me with sort of cognitive issues going, what's going on?
That's true. Yeah.
It's funny.
That is actually to say who character is when they reappear. I definitely know some people who I watch telly with who could definitely use that.
Oh yeah, I think I've been to too many art house movies where I've got no idea what's going on. We're getting some really interesting questions. Someone's asked, what's been your worst experience with a heckler? And do you think audiences are less inclined to heckle someone with a vision impairment, a VIP as you've described them?
Yes, I do think it's more likely, less likely to be heckled as a visually impaired comedian, which I could take that as patronising, but I'll just take it. I think the heckle I remember most was when I hadn't said I was visually impaired, and so apart from losing certain costumes or knocking stuff over accidentally, they wouldn't have known. And this woman once said, "You've got to change your material, mate," which was very detailed and specific.
Exactly.
If she'd just sworn at me, I would have at least been able to chalk it off as just sort of abuse or maybe drunken swearing. But the fact that it was actually
It's like
kind
a
of a bit like
director.
a critique.
It's like a director's note. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then since losing the sight, I think probably my worst experiences have been guide dogs being getting slightly upset, and there's only been a couple of them. But one show when a character I was playing basically had to be sick, or I had to pretend to be sick, and the dog got very, very concerned and did a lot of barking for a good 30 seconds. There's another guide dog that did a couple of stage invasions once, so they've been the ones who have possibly been the most difficult audience members.
That's fantastic. What have you been up to during COVID-19? You're a creative individual. You're probably used to performing, or if you're not performing, you're getting ready to perform, and you've obviously had gigs cancelled, like Melbourne. So, what have you been up to?
Yeah, it has been strange because it's been this sort of counterfactual, like we were saying earlier. I've been sort of chalking the counterfactual reality of Melbourne. Then I would have come back to the UK in the run up to Edinburgh, and it was I was doing this show this year, 2020 Visions, so it was a sort of perfect year for this show. And yeah, well, like everyone, I've been in lockdown. In the UK, our lockdown started on 23rd of March. So basically came home a lot earlier to the UK than had been anticipating, and then we went straight into lockdown. And I was lucky enough to be able to come back and live with my parents. So there's not been the financial pressure that there's been on a lot of creatives in the UK and Australia. But yeah, the opportunities to perform have obviously been shut down immediately, and into the medium and long term, it's not looking great. And it's not only longer term prospects, but just the medium term. Not sure when the next show will be. Like the next one I've got booked in is Edinburgh 2021.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to do some writing, sort of writing just about my time in Australia, and trying to, by describing the sort of the everyday of my time in Australia, trying to find the funny in the everyday. And I think that's always a good tip that people have given, like write either a daily diary or a retrospective on a time, and you'll find like comic turns of phrase or comic ideas that you didn't necessarily know existed in there beforehand.
And some people are really clever at then reflecting that back to a cultural group or a group. There's, I'm probably showing my age. There's a Irish guy came to Australia, Jim Oyen, who was really big for a while here in Australia. Talk to anybody who's Irish, they're like, oh yeah, I think he won a talent quest back in Dublin or something. But in Australia for a while, he was really big. But what he was really good at was reflecting back to Australians some of the crazy stuff. And I remember one of his gags was always, I don't know what's the matter with Australians. Like it's 42 degrees and people walk around going, geez, it's hot, isn't it? Yeah, of course it's hot. And you sort of laugh when you think, yeah, you do that, don't you? And I think sometimes the outsider plays a great role in bringing that to people's attention. So I like the idea of, journal and record. So,
yeah, I think I've definitely felt like a lot of other comedians are doing stuff on Zoom and stuff online.
Yeah.
I have to say, I don't know whether it's pure laziness, which it could be, lockdown lethargy,
Yeah.
or also, if I were to intellectualize and rationalize it a bit more, I think there's obviously like a deficit there
Yeah.
that uh, with comedy as opposed to like music or serious acting or whatever, you are missing that immediate reaction that
Yeah.
sets comedy apart, that whether comedy is going well or not well by the audience reaction. Because for music or theatre, the audience member can look exactly the same. Their facial expression or the sound they're emitting is the same whether they're enjoying it or hating it.
Yeah. And
And you
musical
can't.
theatre is not about audiences. Sorry, in my experience, it's about itself.
Exactly, yeah.
But you're right. I think, and particularly as we talked earlier about that intimacy, it can be really hard. I mean, look at you and I going through this evening. The trying to be aware of not cutting each other off. You say
Mm,
something, I think of something. Like if you're face to face, that does make that intimacy piece so much easier. I think that's a really,
definitely.
really good point about it's okay if you're musically performing or doing a soliloquy or something like that. Using Zoom's great. Some of the comedy stuff, a bit harder. Um, and
Yeah.
just sorry, talking about COVID, someone's asked the question. I think they're really keen for me to ask you this question because it's come up about 3 or 4 times from the same
Mm.
person. When do you think it'll be okay to include COVID jokes into your routine? Have you been thinking about any sort of COVID gags?
Well, I mean, I think I think I probably already have actually,
Yeah.
because there was in Adelaide there's a bit in my show where I give like a sort of blind mask sort of thing to someone. I don't know if you have them, but they're a bit like a sleeping mask, but
Yep.
they are used sometimes for like sighted guide training
Yeah,
or
they
whatever.
replicate various conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
But this one was a very basic one, so it does just look like a sort of sleeping mask.
Yep.
Um, and so if you put it on, you can't see, obviously. But when it was an audience member who made the joke the first time that they said, "Oh, is this a face mask?" And it already sort of crept in, and then I started saying like, "Oh, don't, this is for your eyes, not your mouth." And I, I think it's interesting because that was before it had really, it really hit like Australia or the
Yeah.
UK, and I wonder now it won't feel that wouldn't feel as comfortable if I were somehow doing shows. And I think just because it's been um, such a central part of our lives, I think there will be humor and comedy in referring to it. But
Yeah.
I'm sure certain comedians will have to make sure that they're making jokes about the situation and context around it rather
Yeah.
than about those directly affected.
Well, I remember there was a Woody Allen movie where Alan Alda plays this, I think it was Hannah and her sisters or something. So Alan Alda plays this sort of famous comedy movie director, and he gets asked what's comedy, and his response is it's tragedy plus time. So
Mm,
I mean, it was pretty. I mean, I always like that line. It's funny, but there is
yeah,
some degree of truth. What's the quarantine? Well, I'm bad COVID pun. What's the quarantine time before you can make a gag? And I always also like those formulaic jokes. So when I've been thinking of lockdown, there's a whole array of jokes you could do. You just pick a city and just, well, they've been in lockdown, but you couldn't tell the difference pre-COVID to, COVID lockdown. So you could pick any, in Australia, they'd probably pick Canberra or Adelaide.
yeah,
Apologies if for anybody online who's from those cities, but people have that formulaic approach that they can just put in, the variables. So it might be the COVID thing, and then you put in the city or whatever. And I've certainly seen a lot of
yeah.
comedians do that. Um, so I'm just conscious of time. Look at this. We're 5 minutes from the end. So I've got a couple more questions that people have sent in. Someone's asked, who's your favourite comic? at the moment?
Oh, well, that is very. Well, I do love. I do love Chris Morris, who did the Day Today and Brass Eye. I do love the Pythons.
Yep.
Um, and I haven't mentioned like Steve Coogan's I'm Alan Partridge and stuff like that. So and
That's
oh,
very clever.
I do love Auntie Donna in Australia.
Yeah.
Who do like live sketch shows, and I think they've got stuff on the internet as well.
Yeah. So if people wanted to find out more, I mean, here's a plug. This is where you got to
Oh
bring your mug
yes.
up.
Oh yes.
Yeah, I'll audio describe. So Tom's holding a mug with his own name on it, Tom Skelton, in sort of
A Christmas
gratuitous
present. There's only
gratuitous
one available.
self-promotion. So people wanted to check some of your stuff out. Where could they be going to do that?
I've got a Facebook page which is Tom Skelton at Tom Skelton Comedy.
Yep.
Unless it's at Tom Skelton Comedian. I always forget that and I never remember, even though I've said it after every show. So at Tom Skelton Comedy, and then if that doesn't work, at Tom Skelton Comedian.
So if
I think it's comedy.
if people just punched in Tom Skelton comedy into Google, whatever other search engine, they'd be able to locate some stuff. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. All
On
right.
Facebook is the main one.
Yeah. All right. All right. Thanks so much for your time today, Tom. I know it's a
Thanks,
bit of an
Dan.
early start for those of you in the performing arts. But really appreciate you taking time out to have a bit of a chat with us today. So look, all the very best for whatever lies ahead. And I'm sure if you're heading back this way again, I'll track you down and I'll be the guy in the audience laughing really loudly.
Oh, brilliant.
And I'll see if I can bring a seeing eye dog from work to sort of heckle you. So really appreciate your time speaking with us today. So that's fantastic. I just now have to do the wrap up. So thanks everyone for attending. Just remember, Vision Australia is currently offering services still via telehealth in all states except South Australia. Appointments are conducted over the phone, via video, conferencing, email, or a combination of those. You can contact our assistive technology help desk if you'd like support in setting up for telehealth. So please call Vision Australia on 1300 847466 or email info@visionaustralia.org for more information and to get started. Now, I have to give you some sad news. This was our final check-in and chat session. It's been great to keep connected during the last few months, and we hope you've really enjoyed the series. We're currently looking at some other webinars that we're developing and that we hope will be available in the near future, and we'll let you know when they are ready. So please continue to look at our website and your emails to get that information. And if you've missed any of the webinars or you just thought they were awesome, particularly the ones I've hosted, you can check that out at our webpage at www.visionaustralia.org/check-in-and-chat/webinars. And also a big thank you to Courtney and Naomi in the back office, so to speak, for pulling these all together. Thanks again, everybody, and bye for now.